Disclaimer. First things first, this video is not a review of Silksong or Hollow Knight. This is a critique of what seems to be an underlying systemic problem with this series. The video footage you're about to see consists of Hollow Knight footage I captured vanilla on PS5, whereas for Silksong, the footage I will be using is from my PC and is heavily modded. I will address why I've gone through with this decision later on in the video. I do like Hollow Knight to an extent. If you had to recommend this duology to somebody, on paper, I'd be the most perfect candidate. I am a horrifically tenacious and persistent gamer. I've enjoyed almost every metroidvania game I've ever played. I constantly seek out the thrill of new Souls-likes. I'm a firm believer that music and sound design can make or break a game. I'm a sucker for Tim Burton's art style. In my personal life, I am drawn to melancholy like a moth to a flame. I find beauty in sadness. I am fascinated with weird creatures, both in fiction and reality. And like the average modern gamer, I'm starving for games that seek out their own distinct artistic identity. I am not afraid to meet challenging games on their own terms. I love learning new mechanics and systems. I do not believe in keeping genres rigid and stagnant. I prefer when games attempt to innovate and take risks, something the industry is sorely lacking. I beat Hollow Knight about 2 to 3 years ago. I was going through an obsessive-compulsive phase of trophy hunting that lasted close to a decade, and if I wanted that shiny, meaningless blue and silver trophy next to a particular game on my PSN profile, a skill check was never gonna stop me. I've put up with incredible amounts of bullshit to get my 101 platinum trophies. The only reason I've quit this hobby is for the simple reason that I like the numbers just the way they are. Now that the plats are in the triple digits, it no longer bothers me. I am rather content with these arbitrary and meaningless stats, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. I'm rather fond of quite a few platinums I've attained, and I still remember most of them in sequence. My second ever platinum Bloodborne, my 8th one The Evil Within, I still remember how the notoriously difficult Akumu mode drove me up a fucking wall. The platinums I remember enjoying the most were Dark Souls Remastered, Jedi Fallen Order, Ender Lilies, Cookie Cutter, Fist Forged in Shadow Torch, Resident Evil 2. I vividly remember Sekiro, Lies of P, Laika Age Through Blood, all of which had a particularly hard skill floor. And I also greatly treasure the memories I have attached to platinums such as Signalis, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Death Stranding 1, Days Gone, Ghost of Tsushima, and possibly my favorites, Dead Space 2 and Cyberpunk 2077. There are too many tedious platinums I haven't even bothered mentioning, despite those taking a much bigger toll. There have also been some amazing difficult games I've never platinumed purely because of either it had a few multiplayer trophies I couldn't care less about, some trophies were too absurd and lost the plot, or some trophies became unattainable due to service shutting down. None of this is meant to be a flex. I have no delusions of being a god-tier gamer, I just know that as long as I'm fully engaged and interested, there isn't a game on God's green earth that my neurodivergent-ass brain isn't determined enough to beat. And that brings me to Hollow Knight. I wish I could love Hollow Knight as much as I love the idea of Hollow Knight. It's interesting that I'm bringing it up just now when Halloween is around the corner because I still vividly remember putting Hollow Knight in my video list of top 10 Halloween games for 2022. In retrospect, I recommended it purely on vibes alone. Hollow Knight has made me feel a particular way that no other game has managed to, even though I can confidently say that I don't enjoy most of what it has to offer. I did say that I managed to get one of the endings, presumably the default bad ending, so I was pretty far ahead, certainly far enough for the ship to have sailed for me to complain about the game being too hard. Frankly, I don't even recall Hollow Knight being that extremely hard, but the thing that still puzzles me is that Hollow Knight was one of the extremely rare cases where I couldn't be bothered to put up with what little there was left to see in the endgame. For years, I could not put my finger on why a game that seemed so perfect for me couldn't hold my interest for shit. What befuddled me more than that is that it still has one of my favorite gaming moments of all time, when you approach the window pane overlooking the City of Tears. Surely that must have counted for something, right? So fast forward a few years and Silksong finally shadow drops. Enough time has passed for me to have forgotten my gripes with the original, but not enough time had passed to forget that incredible moment from the City of Tears. Nostalgia can be quite deceptive sometimes, so naturally I decide to buy Silksong. It was obviously going to be a bigger game than Hollow Knight, hence why it was no longer a planned DLC. It had ambition, it had the well-established soulful art style, and it released with a perceptibly competitive price point in the middle of gaming's most underwhelming generation in decades. The stars just seemed to align. And so I boot up my old digital copy of Hollow Knight on my PlayStation in preparation for Silksong. And I start playing these games back to back. I figured this would help me easily see the differences, the improvements, and potential downgrades in real time, with no nostalgic lens clouding my judgment. I didn't remember anything about Hollow Knight standing out much in terms of mechanics, but the one thing that always irked me were the controls being too floaty for my liking. The lack of weight or momentum meant that there was hardly any buffer between my hand-eye coordination and moment-to-moment tactics, if at all. This meant that neither the knight's actions nor the enemies would telegraph well enough to know what the heck is going on during even the slightest of hectic battles. More on this later. Right off the bat, I could tell Silksong controlled ever so slightly better. The speed showed a bit more restraint, the melee had an ever so slight wind-up, giving the attacks a semblance of feedback. Overall, Hornet was just that tad bit more responsive and fun to control than the knight. It wasn't a stark contrast, but it was enough to notice. I had hoped things would only get better from here, but unfortunately it mostly got worse. To get the positives out of the way, I genuinely enjoy the new pogo system. I found the old one a bit awkward and finicky to control, as it wasn't always intuitive to hold down the left stick in the sweet spot just between down and diagonal. The emphasis on needing to always stay on the move made finding the sweet spot even more of a chore. Given how often you were verging on diagonal flicks, to me it made perfect sense to remap the pogo to a diagonal propulsion. And by the same token of how die-hard fans of the original thought the pogo felt natural and couldn't get used to the new one, I inversely had the opposite effect where I never found the original pogo intuitive, but never seemed to have a problem using the diagonal one in Silksong. In addition, I enjoy the newly high contrast and saturated look that Silksong has opted for. The sound design is as impeccable as ever, the characters are just as fun, quirky, and full of personality as they always were, and the music was almost as good as I remember it, even though admittedly I haven't heard anything so far that is as profoundly beautiful as the City of Tears theme. It also somehow doesn't feel as atmospheric as the original Hollow Knight, even though the world can feel quite alive at times, thanks to the increased emphasis on destructible objects and physics-driven debris. Though I suppose the culprit here isn't the atmosphere, it's that Silksong's tone has shifted quite a bit from where Hollow Knight once began. It kinda lacks that whimsical feeling that places like the Forgotten Crossroads and Green Path used to evoke. I'm sure someone in the comments can pinpoint the exact lore behind why Silksong's tone feels this way, though I cannot say I care much for lore in video games. I adore environmental storytelling, I love subtle and nuanced cinematics, and I love interactive storytelling through player agency. But when it comes to endless lore dumps about backstories and things that have already happened, I could not care less. I do like reading as a hobby, just not when I'm gaming. This is all a long-winded way to say that most of the things that I did like in the original, as few as those things were, I still like them here in Silksong. I also like the fact that Team Cherry switched things up with Hornet in terms of playstyle. The knight was clearly meant to be played as a spell sword, whereas Hornet is clearly a dex character. I didn't mind the charm system of Hollow Knight, I neither liked it nor hated it. It was just there and I simply put up with it. As far as the new crest system goes, I feel an equal amount of ambivalence. It's a one step forward, one step back approach where each crest gives you a new moveset, which basically behaves like a set of weapon arts like in Sekiro, which is then offset by making the complementary tools color-coded, therefore quite limited and restricted with what you can do with each crest. I appreciate that things got switched up, but I'd be lying if I wasn't hoping for something that was objectively better rather than just objectively different. I've only obtained 2 crests so far, and I like the aggressive beast crest much more than the starting hunter crest, and that includes the pogo. Given there's a good amount of crest left to find and abilities left to unlock, it seems obvious that both combat and traversal are much more fluid and seamless than they were in Hollow Knight. But as far as positives go, this is where my list ends. The unfortunate reality is that the same gripes I had with Hollow Knight are still incredibly present in Silksong. And if there are any new gripes, they are most certainly some kind of unexpected byproduct of the scope creep that evidently brings this game overall quality down. Having taken a few years off from the original Hollow Knight and now returning to it with Silksong recontextualizing the whole experience, I think I've finally identified the underlying problems I have with this duology. I genuinely don't feel difficulty is the problem here, it's just a symptom that has naturally formed out of some less obvious, albeit much more serious problems pertaining to design principles. Despite the differences between Hollow Knight and Silksong, I think the underlying problem across both titles is one and the same: the excessive, negative reinforcement. These games aren't really that difficult. The underlying problem is that Hollow Knight and Silksong are bloated and suffocating under the weight of their own tedium. Tedium that is disguised as difficulty. Everywhere you look in regards to discussions about Hollow Knight and Silksong, you'll find the same old tired arguments, bad faith arguments. If it's not the generic quote-unquote skill issue, comment number 4587 for the day, it's the classic quote, "This is how Metroidvania and Souls-like games have always been," end quote. As someone whose favorite genres happens to be the trifecta of survival horror, Metroidvania, and Souls-likes, and it's no coincidence that these 3 genres overlap all the time, sometimes even with immersive sims and roguelikes, this comment is insufferable bullshit. First of all, Hollow Knight is not a Souls-like. It's not even a Soulsvania. For proper Souls-like Metroidvania games, these are your best options in no particular order. Ender Lilies, Quietus of the Nights, Death's Gambit Afterlife, Salt and Sanctuary, which is literally 2D Dark Souls, Vigil the Longest Night, Dark Devotion, Soldiers, Withering Rooms, and Mandragora Whispers of the Witch Tree. What these games have that Hollow Knight does not is as follows. Stamina resource management is the key to success, evasion and aggression both depend on stamina, player input holds weight and requires commitment, weapon and moveset variety that fundamentally changes playstyles, which adds to the replay value, RPG stats and level up systems, attacks that have clear telegraphs and or audible cues, and enemies will not respawn until you rest at a resting spot. Whereas the only Souls-like traits that Hollow Knight borrows are corpse running, runbacks, environmental storytelling, and charms that work similar to rings and runes. That's less than half of the standard criteria of your average Souls-like game, and most of them do meet the majority of the criteria. I dare you to find a single other Souls-like that only borrows this exact same set of criteria that Hollow Knight does. You'd be forgiven to think Hollow Knight is a Souls-like given how obvious some of the nods and homages to Dark Souls are, especially because of the whole hollowing cliché, but in terms of the criteria of what makes a Souls-like game, Hollow Knight does not meet most of the criteria. That said, Hollow Knight interestingly does borrow the rally system unique to Bloodborne in the FromSoft catalog, though I would argue it's nowhere near as competent. The reason for its incompetence is the same reason some other mechanics feel incompetent, so we'll come back to it once we can lump some other issues into the mix, as they highlight a through line in the fundamental flaw holding back Team Cherry's design philosophy. So we've established Hollow Knight is not a Souls-like, so what is it then? The answer is simple. It's a Metroidvania. More specifically, it's an action platformer set in a sprawling yet interconnected 2D world map. As per usual, the map is segmented into different biomes, featuring tons of initially inaccessible paths, secret rooms, and shortcuts that are meant to be revisited once you get a variety of tools and upgrades in no specific order. This means that a Metroidvania's #1 priority is to continuously reward the extremely open-ended level design by incentivizing exploration at all costs. This simple Metroidvania premise is exactly why the argument proposing that this is how Metroidvanias and Souls-like have always worked completely falls flat on its face and exposes anyone resorting to such an argument as being those who ironically have not played that many Metroidvanias or Souls-likes. They just like Hollow Knight and Hollow Knight only. Or best case scenario, they are grossly misremembering what makes these genres, because Hollow Knight's most immediate problem is sitting right in front of our faces. It is not a Souls-like Metroidvania, it is a Metroidvania that arbitrarily borrows the few Souls-like traits and gimmicks that not only add nothing to the Metroidvania formula, they directly clash with the Metroidvania design philosophy. This ultimately creates a game that is consistently at conflict with itself. This conflict is reflected from the inside out, from the game's incompatible design philosophies all the way out to the millions of players who have formed polar opposite opinions about its divisive nature. Let's unpack some of these conflicting design philosophies. The Metroidvania genre is all about exploration. The same way a survival horror game's job is to incentivize you as the player to think of combat as a puzzle of logistics and tactics by forcing you to backtrack and explore for supplies and keys to progress, a Metroidvania game's job is to incentivize you to explore the world and look for cool new abilities and keys to progress. You can see how these lines blur if, say, an indie dev would attempt to make a survival horror Metroidvania like in Withering Rooms, the resources themselves become the abilities or substitute them. But in Hollow Knight's case, the premise is traditional and pertains to finding new game-changing movement abilities. Tangible resources didn't come much into play until Silksong added tools into the mix. Souls-likes too follow a similar form of meta progression through a more straightforward numerical stat increase. You're not exactly increasing your inventory or ability bandwidth in the most tangible way, but you are increasing stat numbers such as stamina, HP, mana, and consumables that behave almost exactly like survival horror's limited supplies or Metroidvania's abilities that run on a cooldown before they are reactivated. This is why as the years progress, we are seeing these three genres intersect frequently. Souls-like such as Bloodborne started bleeding into survival horror territory, then Resident Evil started borrowing from Bloodborne, which was already borrowing from Resident Evil 4, but also happens to be borrowing from Dark Souls, which was borrowing from the Metroidvania games for its interconnected design for the Kingdom of Lordran, which is something Resident Evil Remake on the GameCube also kinda did with the layout of the mansion. You get the point. These three genres have a lot in common, and I predict the lines are gonna blur more and more as the years go by. You would think, given how interconnected these genres seem to be, that the natural conclusion would be to embrace Souls-likes and Metroidvanias merging as one. The problem isn't in embracing the overlap, the problem is that not all of the criteria from all three genres are compatible. There needs to be some compromises for the overlaps to fit neatly. After all, genres eventually stop being rigid, they tend to become modular. Much like how you have to pick which key goes in which lock, you have to pick which Souls-like elements will complement the Metroidvania elements, depending on the design philosophy you're going for. Bloodborne's aggressive and retaliating design philosophy works for Bloodborne, but it wouldn't work for Dark Souls' slower, more methodical, and trepidatious approach. The Bloodborne Hunter would be too overpowered and fast for a game like Dark Souls 1, whereas the Chosen Undead would be too underpowered and slow for a game like Bloodborne. Despite both of them being Souls-likes, or if you want to be pedantic, Soulsborne games, even they had to make alterations to fit the subtle yet significant shifts in design philosophy, despite sharing the same mechanical template and genre. Look at how many changes had to be made for such a small shift. Now imagine just how much more intentional the changes have to be in order to translate this design philosophy properly to not just any Metroidvania, but a traditional 2D side-scroller. Ender Lilies has a better understanding on just how much of a daunting task this is, and even if you invert the whole process from a 2D Metroidvania to a 3D one, even Dark Souls understood that some compromises have to be made. For example, it would have been extremely complicated to retain the structure of finding new physical abilities throughout the world in order to open new avenues for traversal, as this would imply that you had to start your journey even more under-equipped than you already were. Imagine you start Dark Souls 1 and you find out you can't roll or sprint and jump, or be able to plunge to the bottom and deal devastating damage onto the Asylum Demon down below. This isn't to say it couldn't work in theory, but let's be honest, would Dark Souls opening be as interesting or engaging if it didn't have a modicum of decency to provide you even the most basic of movesets at its disposal? Imagine how detrimental this would have been on the exploration incentive if the gameplay loop was underwhelming right from the start. This is where the numerical stats come in. Instead of handicapping your basic abilities, you are instead drip-fed your sense of progression by making the bonk numbers go bigger. The game-changing abilities come not from finding new movesets, but by making the levels of each stat grow big enough for you to be allowed to use new weapons without being penalized. Instead of finding new abilities and movesets, you have total agency to dictate what movesets you unlock by simply allocating souls, your main form of currency, to the stats that align with the weapons and, by proxy, the movesets you find around the map and wish to wield, all within the comfort of your closest bonfire. This is not to say Dark Souls 1 isn't a punishing game, it absolutely is. But the more you unravel its esoteric nature, the more you realize just how fair in its punishment it truly is. The more you understand its mechanisms and structures, the more you realize that the overwhelming majority of your failures and deaths have only you to blame. You just weren't aware at the time because the game doesn't spell it out for you. Some exceptions do exist, no game is truly perfect, but they're few and far between. There's something incredibly reassuring about that fact, and you can take it one of two ways. You can either feel like a victim and give up, or you can take this as an opportunity to learn from your mistakes, knowing fully well that whether you see this game through to the end lives and dies by your own hand. You have complete player agency more than you know. In comparison, Hollow Knight carries over a similar degree of punishment, but forgets to compensate you with a hook that motivates you to persevere. It lacks that metatextual element that made Dark Souls so famous for saving people from severe depression, including me. From the minute you set foot in Lordran, Dark Souls is drip-feeding you with all sorts of weapons, rings, merchants to buy consumables from, jaw-dropping vistas, and an awe-inducing sense of scale. This last characteristic is rather difficult to pull off in a 2D game, as you're limited to what you see from side to side. Your sense of scale and your 2D character's sense of scale are not aligned, because what you see and what your character sees are completely different. 2D is so lacking in terms of depth compared to 3D that the most efficient way to fabricate a sense of depth is to blur certain parts of the background from the foreground. Otherwise, the sense of immersion would be borderline non-existent. In this sense, a 3D Metroidvania like Dark Souls already has the upper hand, because the simple addition of a third dimension, the one that is allowing you to see whatever your character sees, means that you are constantly being incentivized to explore, for the simple reason that you can look somewhere far off in the distance and decide you wish to go there. Whereas in a 2D space, unless you have a map indicating that long journey either to the left or to the right might prove useful to you, you are never sure there's a real incentive to explore beyond the borders of the screen. This is why when you compare Dark Souls 1 to a Metroidvania game like Salt and Sanctuary, which is the closest thing to a 2D adaptation of Dark Souls 1, you will notice that despite both games lacking a map to help you navigate, you will find it relatively easy to reorient yourself and regain your bearings in Dark Souls, and comparatively miserable in Salt and Sanctuary. This strongly suggests that 2D games lack a certain intuition when it comes to a sense of direction. Therefore, a map is not only crucial, but its clarity will directly impact the quality of the exploration, the quality of the Metroidvania experience. In spite of it lacking a map, I somehow still find myself enjoying wandering through the world of Salt and Sanctuary more so than in Hollow Knight's Hallownest or Silksong's Farloom. The reason wasn't always clear to me, but I have suspected the culprit long ago, and now with a couple more years of Metroidvania experience under my belt, my suspicion was right all along. The biggest flaw in Team Cherry's design philosophy is contact damage. Contact damage is by far the worst decision Team Cherry's ever made with both Hollow Knight and Silksong. It is the most cheap and unnatural way to fabricate a sense of challenge. It seems harmless at first, but even as early as the Forgotten Crossroads in Hollow Knight, you start to see why this system is so hopelessly counterintuitive. There is a reason that most Metroidvanias don't use contact damage, and when they do, they use it sparingly. With contact damage enabled, the playing field is immediately lopsided in favor of the enemy. Right out the gate, this signals to the player that the game is completely disinterested in any sort of fair challenge. This isn't to say contact damage wouldn't make sense in any circumstance. For example, if the knight was to come into contact with a hedgehog, not only would you expect the knight to take damage, but even tolerate it. This is because your brain sees this as something plausible. It facilitates the suspension of disbelief. A hedgehog's spikes will sting you if you threaten it, so you accept this as a legitimate consequence. The problem with Team Cherry's games is that the contact damage is everywhere, with no rhyme or reason. It is even in places where it doesn't make sense to have it. It makes no sense, for example, for the knight to jump in a head-on collision with the most basic fly enemy and have the knight take 1 point of damage, but not this harmless, unsuspecting enemy. It's not some sophisticated creature with a built-in defense mechanism, it's just a fly. I'm sure one counter-argument would be that without contact damage, these flies would pose no threat. And while that isn't wrong, it doesn't make contact damage any less of a horrible solution. I'm sure many of you have heard before in other video essays preaching about how Hollow Knight is all about positioning. And while yes, positioning plays a big role, this argument is also kind of a crutch. It's being apologist for design choices that could have been done much better than what we ended up getting. The lazy thing about contact damage is that it makes itself indistinguishable from every other attack. If an enemy or a boss can still inflict 1 mask's worth of damage every time it repositions itself for an upcoming attack, then why does it even need to reposition itself to begin with? Why even bother attacking? Contact damage is further exacerbated when you consider other factors, such as the knight's floaty controls, the knight and hornet having poor melee range, and the flawed healing system. It's been touted many times that the healing system is great because it incentivizes aggression, but in reality it doesn't. It's trying to put its own spin on Bloodborne's rally mechanic with little success. What Bloodborne does to incentivize aggression is to give you a brief window of opportunity to restore most, if not all of your health back in the middle of a fight. The temporary window of opportunity indicates that you cannot wait around and play passively. You have to risk it all and take another swing or two at the enemy to reclaim what was taken from you. This isn't what Hollow Knight is doing. If you look closer, what Hollow Knight is actually doing is using both Bloodborne's rally mechanic and Dark Souls' Estus Flask system in a bastardized, incompatible way. For anyone who's ever played both of these games, you already know why these systems are incompatible. Bloodborne's rally system is all about urgency. Dark Souls' Estus Flask system is all about stalling, waiting for the right opportunity to heal. They're completely antithetical to one another. And even if Hollow Knight was to ditch the need to hold the circle button for every heal, that still does not account for the fact that on top of the rally mechanic, Bloodborne still gave you instant healing methods in the form of blood vials, which work just like Estus Flasks but way faster, which cancels out Dark Souls' incentive of having to wait. The way Hollow Knight has hybridized both of these systems is just not all that compatible with the ethos of aggression. The feedback loop consists of having you to get up close and personal to regain your soul meter, so that then you will have to make a choice between spending it on a spell that does 4 nail swipes worth of damage at once, or you spend it on a slow heal that will most likely get you killed. This obviously suggests that the game wants you to go for a spell attack rather than a heal, and it would have been a tolerable system if you just had to learn the enemy's attack patterns. But the mere presence of contact damage means that you are constantly being discouraged to get up close and personal to regain the very soul meter you require to stay on top of the fight. Even worse is the fact that this being a 2D game that is lacking the depth of a 3D game, the visuals can get cluttered really quick, and that just doesn't mesh well with the contact damage at all. You're essentially being punished just for trying to keep up with a couple of enemies that have microscopic telegraphing. Sometimes there's just too many enemies cluttering the screen to even be able to go anywhere to reposition yourself. This becomes somehow even more problematic in Silksong because now every hit does double damage. Many have made the argument that this is fair because you get to heal 3 masks in return, but in practical terms, what you're essentially doing is the equivalent of taking 1 mask's worth of damage in the original Hollow Knight, and instead of healing 1 mask every 1.5 seconds, you're healing 1.5. The problem is that the extra half mask you gained is not significant enough to count as an extra life point, so in reality, you still have only healed 1 mask, making the whole exercise utterly pointless. Not only is this change in healing illusory and disingenuous about the benefits you're allegedly gaining, But now you also don't have the means to back out of it. In Hollow Knight, you had to hold the heal button for a certain amount of time before it registered as a heal. If you felt like you didn't have enough time, you were free to disengage and continue to stall the fight until a better healing opportunity presented itself. It was tedious, but it did have its advantages. Silksong gives the illusion of benefit because it feels better to heal, as you don't need to hold the button down every single time. But what essentially happened here is we sacrificed this one tedium of many and substituted it with a healing system that is much less versatile. The healing has more stakes than ever now, and it seems Team Cherry is aware that it's pushing the limit here, so they made the action a simple tap instead of a button hold. There are systems on top of other systems designed to punish you and keep you from progressing, and the few systems set in place to compensate for such punishment are nowhere near sufficient enough to level the playing field. This isn't to say Hollow Knight is designed in a way you can't beat the game, obviously that is not the case, but it's definitely designed to stall your progress instead of challenge you properly. The evidence is all over these games, and it's not just in the way healing and contact damage have been implemented. The exploration itself follows the same template of incompatible design philosophies, and nothing highlights this better than the boss runbacks and the in-game economy. Back when Hollow Knight came out, runbacks were still a common practice, so we all put up with it. But in that 8-year time span, this kind of game design slowly but surely eroded away. Even from software games themselves, the games that were famous for their runbacks would eventually decide to trivialize this aspect of the game design with the inclusion of the stakes of Marika and Elden Ring. There's a reason a meticulous game director such as Miyazaki himself and all kinds of other game creators, indie or otherwise, have left tedious runbacks in the past where they belong. And that's because, contrary to what a few contrarians will have you believe, these runbacks serve no real purpose and they're an outdated game design. We're not talking about some niche retro quality like fixed camera angles of the early 2000s horror games where people pretend they're outdated, but in reality they're just too stubborn to take 5 minutes to get the hang of the concept. We're talking about a symptom from the old days of the arcade machine that has no justifiable reason to exist anymore on your PC or console. It used to make sense for arcade games to be quarter munchers because the machines designed for those were astronomically expensive to produce. But it makes no sense for modern video games, physical and even less so digital, to have quarter munching sensibilities when the arcade machine is nowhere to be found. What this is doing is psychologically manipulating the audience into thinking we're back in the good old days of gaming because we've kept the quarter munching attitude without the actual physical quarter munching. And we've substituted it for way bigger time sinks instead of tangible money. You wasted quarters on a 15 to 30 minute long arcade game in the 80s and 90s, and now instead of quarters, you're sacrificing your self-respect by letting the game rob hours upon hours upon hours of your precious time in life. Think of it this way, some essayists out there will have you believe that runbacks serve the purpose of downtime or to condition you to get better at the game on your way to a boss fight. But when you think about how much arcade machine style padding there is here, and how much time you have had to dedicate to even get to a boss fight in the first place, why would you even need more of the thing you already learned to do if you've already learned to do it to even get to where you are to begin with? Consider the other point of view that argues that this long run back will intentionally discourage you and indirectly cause you to try going somewhere else. The problem is that the systems put into place to punish you are so disparaging that you as the player are conditioned to become wary of exploring other avenues. If, hypothetically, you decided to come back later and go somewhere else for the time being, there's just too many headaches to consider. For starters, if you kept dying to a boss, this means that you have consistently dropped all your precious geo or rosary beads right outside the arena, or sometimes even inside the arena itself. Considering how needlessly tedious and time-consuming it is to grind for currency in Hollow Knight and Silksong, this setback immediately focuses all of your attention back towards returning to the boss arena and not towards exploring new places. The incentive to explore is then diminished even further by the fact that most roads lead to nowhere substantial. You have been taught and conditioned by metroidvania games to smack away at walls for secrets like a complete idiot, and yet for the vast majority of both of these games, there just aren't that many walls worth breaking. Even when you do eventually find one, the rewards are mostly anticlimactic. It's usually just containing more geo or rosaries, the same stuff you've already been desperately accumulating on your way to the secret area. As if these things weren't enough to sap all the joy out of the exploration, there's more. Getting lost and exploring is part of the fun in metroidvanias, they say, and yet of all the metroidvanias I have played, Hollow Knight and Silksong are the only two metroidvanias that feel overstretched and spread too thin. The levels and pathways are needlessly long and drawn out, and the unfortunate consequence is that even art as astounding as Ari Gibson's becomes repetitive. Not only does it start to overstay its welcome, your brain also starts to associate the miserable experience with this art style, and it gives it an unfairly negative connotation. In other words, both the game's welcoming art design and the hostile mechanical design have such a suffocating grip on the game that it feels as though one is trying to overshadow the other instead of having them synergize and bring out the best in each other. I had hoped the needlessly drawn-out stretches of backtracking through the same areas and dealing with the same unengaging enemies would become a thing of the past over the 8 years it took for Silksong to come out, but unfortunately my suspicions of the opposite happening became true. The map in Hollow Knight was already too big for its own good, and in Silksong it's just overkill. You can tell the map was needlessly expanded because now it takes even longer to obtain anything of significant interest. This was the true deal-breaker for me that drove me to my decision to use mods for Silksong. It is that simple. I've just run out of patience. A death by 1,000 cuts will do that to you. I don't care that it's difficult, and I sure as heck am not asking for Team Cherry to add an easy journalist mode. But I do care that it uses artificial difficulty to waste the player's time. My time. If I'm not going to get rewarded for putting up with something that should only take 5 minutes, I sure as hell am not going to play along and let the game stretch that 5-minute long misery into several underwhelming hours of my life. People can strawman argue the whole deal with artificial difficulty and pretend that all difficulty is artificial all they want, but in reality, we all know what artificial difficulty means. We know it when we see it. It's the kind of difficulty that breaks the immersion. It's difficulty for difficulty's sake, meant to keep you running in your hamster wheel like an idiot, while the devs laugh all the way to the bank. It's not the challenging but fair motto of Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, or the countless hard metroidvania games out there. It's the modern AAA motto. That of Resident Evil 8's Village of Shadows difficulty, Resident Evil 3's Inferno mode, Resident Evil 4's Professional mode. This isn't a real challenge, it's manufactured streamer bait. It's malicious at worst and incompetent at best. The newest excuse for Silksong, similar to the, quote, "you must be new to metroidvanias," end quote, is that Hollow Knight is the tutorial for Silksong and that you are supposed to play that first. If this claim was truthful, then, by that logic, Silksong wouldn't have had to need to strip Hornet down to the Knight's starting abilities from the first game. Stripping all the abilities away is something every sequel of every franchise has ever done, specifically so that newcomers can easily start from there, so this claim obviously holds no real weight. I genuinely don't think Team Cherry intended for their entire audience to have beaten and mastered the first Hollow Knight, so much as that they have simply forgotten that they're making a brand new sequel instead of an endgame DLC. To a seasoned player, it might feel like Team Cherry is just giving you an opportunity to relive your first time playing Hollow Knight with no upgrades and discovering the map for the first time. The only problem is the 8-year gap and all the Silk posting has done nothing but cultivate uncontrollable and unmerited levels of hype, uncontrollable enough to break out of its own niche. If Team Cherry really, honestly, truly wanted to temper people's expectations, they would have said something. But they chose to stay silent. It's the perfect marketing strategy for your game. Hollow Knight was always somewhat of an outlier in its popularity, but with Silksong, the franchise has gotten so popular, it's been branded as the GTA 6 of indie games. Which is an apt comparison, because even a company as big as Rockstar Games uses the same marketing tactic to say nothing and let the curiosity culture surrounding the lack of news and information to build the hype by itself. At that point, you just have to face the reality that you are no longer making a niche game for a specific group of dedicated fans. The phenomenal art style that is clashing with the punishing, time-wasting nature of the game has too much broad appeal for it to be gate-kept so hard. That in itself is paradoxical game design. You have all the ambitions and trappings of any other sequel you'll find in AAA development: bigger scope, bigger budget, bigger spectacle, bigger worlds, bigger bloat, it's all there. But then in between all these trappings, you still awkwardly keep in all the rough edges made specifically for a particular group of masochists, and it just doesn't work on such a grand scale. I don't usually advocate for game designers to sand down the rough edges in games, but it seems Team Cherry has unironically run into the same exact problem as AAA, where they ended up in the same dead end, but from a different angle. The bipolar nature of Silksong strongly suggests that Team Cherry wants to have its cherry cake and eat it too. It wants to do all of the things a sequel tends to do, including adding all kinds of new bells and whistles to draw in tons of new players, but it also wants to slap them in the face with some contact damage and tell them that this isn't for you, this is for the elitist masochists only. You've heard it a million times over the past few weeks how Silksong has quote-unquote shown AAA gaming how it's done, but pardon the pun, it seems like we're just cherry-picking here. Cherry-picking our winners and losers in the gaming news every other week, it feels like. The fact of the matter is, even though Silksong does not come with a hefty price tag, you're still paying for it long after you've purchased it. Time is money, and unfortunately it's been apparent for a long while now that most gamers don't seem to realize that. We have this false perception that the longer a game is, the higher the quality. We seem to have finally noticed that when it comes to AAA, but when it comes to Hollow Knight and its even bigger sister Silksong, we still haven't gotten to that same realization yet. Make no mistake, Silksong might be physically packaged as an indie game, but it is a AAA game in spirit. The reality is that although Silksong pretends it only costs 20 euros, it costs way more than that. Not only does it overstay its welcome and do everything in its power to kick the horse while it's still down, by providing very little reward for all the risks you take, but it's also running along with the narrative that you should have played the original, so that in case you haven't, you end up buying the original as well and extend your misery and disappointment even further. Altogether, your total is already within the price range of a AA game, and on top of that, you're also paying with your sanity and your wasted time. The epitome of AAA game design. The unfortunate truth is that if you don't enjoy Silksong, Hollow Knight isn't likely to change your mind or even help you get better at Silksong. I found Silksong starts off a lot easier than Hollow Knight, and frankly, if it wasn't for the poor decision to make Hornet take 2 masks worth of damage instead of 1, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Hornet starts off with 5 masks but can only take 3 hits before it's game over. It makes no sense for it to be like this, and frankly, the game would have been better off if she just started off with 3 masks. After all, this is how Hollow Knight was originally planned in its early stages of development. Given Hornet was bested twice by the Knight in the original, I would have easily played along with the idea and could get behind the idea of her just starting with 3 masks. It would have also instantly fixed the problem that many players have expressed frustration with, that being obtaining 4 mask shards is a total waste of time. Because by the egregious amount of time it would have taken to get the first 4 masks, you're still gonna take 3 hits before you die. It's not a real upgrade, it's the illusion of one. If Silksong simply opted for 3 masks and Hornet only lost 1 mask per hit, this would have solved the problem immediately. Before we conclude, I'd like to pivot back towards the runback problem, because this is frankly the most obnoxious flaw among all the flaws in the game. There is a reason these things have all but disappeared from most modern games, not just AAA games, and I'll paint you the picture by using an analogy you'll understand. You know how YouTube, the very app you're watching this video on, has become insufferable with its ads? Do you enjoy having to sit through a minute-long ad or even longer, what seems to feel like every few minutes? Does that ever feel fun, rewarding, or relevant to you? What about mobile games? Don't you just love when a mobile game has a cheap difficulty spike and has you sit through a long ad every time you die? I bet you cannot wait to smash that skip ad button fast enough. That's Silksong's runbacks in a nutshell. It's just as pointless as the ads you watch before you get to the stuff that matters. It's like when Chandler Bing once said, "It's like the stand-up comedian you have to sit through before Pink Floyd comes out." And just like how Ross Geller follows that up by saying, "It's not that we don't like the comedian, it's just that's not why we bought the ticket." It's not that I don't like being in this world, it's that I'm done and I want to go somewhere else. The boss fight. I don't dislike Team Cherry and I do want to love their games, but in this business-to-customer relationship, I'm tired of not being met halfway. I think it's about time Team Cherry realizes and accepts the magnitude of the situation. The ratio of players who get to buy Hollow Knight to the ratio of players who get to enjoy Hollow Knight is extremely disproportionate. Companies no longer just look at sales figures, they look at the player stats, and frankly, they speak for themselves. Eventually, Team Cherry might still not meet the average player halfway. After all this polarity and divisiveness manufactures too much outrage and consequentially too much hype, which means there's too much at stake, too many sales and potential customers, and too much money left on the table. And you'd have to be an absolute fool to think that doesn't play a huge role. Even the most passionate of artists have to put food on their table at the end of the day. But I hope that in the process, some other up-and-coming game designers will step up to the task and fill the void with their own phenomenal metroidvania competitor. Ender Lilies so far has filled most of that gap for me, but I wish we get more games that manage to be just as phenomenal while trying something completely different. Until then, I just hope Team Cherry will someday learn to get out of their own way. And with that, the Raven draws to a conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.